Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the hrQ Ideal Roundtable webinar. I'm your host, Sal Vergara, Vice President, Strategic Partnerships here at hrQ and our parent company, Landrum HR. As always, thanks to our marketing department for orchestrating today's session. You just saw the range of what we deliver to our client partners every day, so please let us know if we can be an extension of your HR team to support any of your human capital initiatives. Before we begin, I ask for a little bit of grace. I'm getting over a sickness, and so if I cough, I apologize in advance as we go through this session. So wanted to get that out of the way so I don't apologize every time I'm coughing here. So the genesis of these sessions happened 2 years ago when I created these roundtables to provide a platform to promote the dialogue around inclusion, diversity, equity, and authentic leadership. The landscape of work continues to dramatically change. Companies must now consider the dynamics of employees working together in noticeably different settings. Now, the $64,000 question is, how do organizations navigate DE&I so that it encapsulates both sets of employee populations and still cultivate a sense of inclusivity? In a recent study by McKinsey, it was uncovered that more than 2 out of 3 employees who preferred a hybrid arrangement said they were more likely to look for other opportunities if asked to return fully on site. Now, having said that, the individuals who enjoyed the accommodations of working from home also said that their sense of inclusion was compromised or diminished. Now, for those who are in traditional underrepresented groups, that lack of inclusion was exacerbated. Now, the risk of ignoring this could result in a rise in turnover, challenges in talent pipelining and attraction, and compromising the long-term viability of your company. Now, to compound that, you have to be sure that you're compliant in all DE&I efforts. There's a magnified sensitivity to all this, and you want to make sure you're not only doing the right thing, but you're paying close attention to detail as it relates to your responsibility of the adherence to the law, data integrity, and your recruiting and talent acquisition process. Today, we'll talk about the intricacies of DE&I compliance and how companies can successfully navigate a diverse and inclusive culture with a hybrid workforce. I'm honored to have assembled a fabulous panel for today's discussion. My first panelist is the Executive Vice President of Administration and DE&I at the second busiest airport in the country, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. In this role, she provides vision, strategy, and direction for the execution of all people-related administrative policies and programs, development of small minority and women-owned businesses, and diversity and affirmative action programs. She has more than 25 years of related experience across multiple industries. She also held leadership and executive level roles for companies including Northrop Grumman, Grainger, PepsiCo, Frito-Lay. Please make welcome Marucci Cantu. My second panelist is a partner in the law office of Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, LLP. He was the previous chair of Orrick's global employment law practice for over 20 years, which has employment law teams in the European Union, Asia, as well as the US. He also is the founder of the firm's Whistleblower Task Force, and he previously served as the managing director of Orrick's litigation division and is published and quoted frequently on a variety of employment law issues in major academic business publications. He's been a frequent speaker at multiple conferences about DE&I, ESG, and other national and international programs. Please make welcome Mike Delicat. My last panelist is known for uncovering blind spots. To achieve optimal performance and enhance retention, she dives in where others tread lightly, yet she's insightful, warm, and approachable. Dr. Starr has spent over 2 decades driving evidence-based inclusion, diversity, and equity in STEM, healthcare, and finance. She's worked with executives, senior leadership, human resource management, and employees with several Fortune 500 companies, helping them create an inclusive culture that thrives in today's business climate. Please make welcome Dr. Lauren Starr. So audience, I have a poll question. As with all my Ideal Roundtables, it helps give our panel some context about general perception about your DE&I strategy. So Monica's going to put up a poll question here in just a second. If you would take a moment to answer this. In the 2 years of the pandemic, did your company reevaluate and or recalibrate your company's DE&I strategy? Yes, to accommodate the various changes in the workplace. No, we haven't, but we think we should. No, we haven't and don't think it's necessary. And I don't know, as we don't talk about it internally. So if you could please answer that. As we're tallying the responses, remember, if you have any questions or comments, please send those into us via the questions pane. I encourage you all to connect with us on LinkedIn. Everyone who registered will receive a link to an on-demand recording of this session. So if you have any questions or would like some guidance, or support in your DE&I strategy or coaching, please let me know and be happy to help. So in the 2 years of the pandemic, did your company reevaluate and or recalibrate your company's DE&I strategy? Take a few more moments to take a look at the responses. And again, if you have any questions, comments, please insert that in the questions pane and we'll address them as we move along in the session. All right, let's look at the results here. Overwhelming 52% yes to accommodate the various changes in the workplace. 25% no, we haven't, but we think we should. 7% no, we haven't, don't think it's necessary. And then the 16% I don't know is we don't talk about it internally, which I encourage all, obviously, for those in the no, in the I don't know as we don't talk about it internally, to reevaluate your stance as we have this conversation. So let's get into it. Panelists, thank you very much for your time again today. I'm going to start off with Lorraine. What do you perceive as the biggest challenge for employees to manage when it comes to DE&I in this new hybrid environment? And how has that evolved since the beginning of COVID?
Yeah, I think when we look at DE&I don't think, regardless of COVID or what's happening in society, the changes around, right, is where we're focused. So I think if we're focused on the right outcome, like inclusion, we can stay that course throughout. And I think, and I'm going to say this, and please feel free to weigh in, COVID's become kind of a scapegoat for DE&I, where a lot of organizations are stepping back and saying, well, we're hybrid, or, you know, we're 100% remote, so it's really hard to do DE&I, when in actuality, COVID's a blessing to diversity and inclusion because it's starting to drive intersectionality. We're starting to see our employees on all of these virtual conversations and Teams meetings, we're starting to see what their home life environment looks like. We're starting to get a better feel for who they are as an individual. So I think, you know, at this point here, organizations need to figure out what they want to focus on, whether it's diversity, whether it's inclusion, whether it's equity. Yes, you cannot focus on all three all the time. It just doesn't work that way. And now intersectionality coming into play.
Now, Lorraine, you mentioned all three of those. Which one do you feel like, if one had to choose which one to focus on first, which one would that be?
So I am absolutely hands down going to say, if you do not have an inclusive organization, then you've got no business doing diversity and equity. And I know that's a strong statement, but this is backed by research and there's a ton of evidence out there. If you don't have an inclusive organization, no matter how many diversity hires you hire, they will leave. Right, turnover is, when I look at an organization and I see high turnover numbers, it's culture. You know, if they're from multiple departments, right? This is a culture issue. So inclusion is absolutely the framework for diversity and equity. I always tell my clients it's I, D, and E. It's not D, E, and I. It's I, D, and E. Inclusion comes first, which draws diversity. And then when you have that diversity and inclusion, that will drive equity.
It's interesting you say that, because hence the reason why we call these ideal roundtables with inclusion first. Sometimes we think when DE&I, diversity is the first thing they hear, it connotes something negative for some, not all. But that was one of the main catalysts or reasons why we wanted to go with the route with ideal, with ID&E. So I'm with you on that, how we describe.
It's not surprising. It's not surprising that we're focused on diversity first in many situations, because that's where the history has been, right? That's where the political and socioeconomic society has been focused on diversity and diversity laws, when actually, right, it's inclusion. Mike?
Yeah, just, two comments on that. I think it is excellent to focus on the I first, especially in the highly politicized environment we've been in since the last presidential election and the last presidential administration. Diversity got somewhat of a dirty name, and there were even government regulations put in place that limited the kind of sensitivity training or diversity training employers could do. That was one of the first actions that was retracted by the Biden administration by executive order after President Biden was inaugurated. But there still is a lot of blowback. There's a lot of resistance to the notion of diversity. And so I think starting with the idea of inclusion, given what has happened in the political and politicized cycle of this event, is important. And then, on a second point you made, while the pandemic has created some new opportunities for doing more on ID&E and similar kinds of initiatives, it's also created challenges, obviously. The days when after a client pitch, the team would go out for a drink or go out for dinner and talk about how we could have done that differently or improve that pitch. The mentoring, especially for more junior members on the team, has gotten harder and harder, because when the Zoom call ends and everyone leaves the meeting, you're on to your next Zoom call. And it's if you're a perfect manager, of course, you'll write down all the notes you want to get back to with respect to people. But unless you've created, circumstances for sharing that feedback, for socializing, for doing other things, it's become a challenge. So I think the pandemic and hybrid or almost all remote workplaces has forced some of our clients to think about how are they going to replace what the informality of getting together outside of scheduled meetings, being together, running into someone in the cafeteria, asking someone to go down and get a cup of coffee, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. All of those opportunities are kind of gone. And if you're really good, you can set up, a virtual coffee with someone. But we all know, as I said, once the calendar starts filling up, you're on to the next thing. So it's created some real challenges and also really caused companies to think more creatively about how in a hybrid environment the objectives of ID&E can still be pursued.
And to your point, Mike, it's made us all reassess what our policies and approaches are within that topic. And I'd be remiss not to mention this, but I'm sure many of you are aware of the Individual Freedom Act in Florida, which is expected to take effect in July 1st. There are challenges pending in court, so at this time we're uncertain of the outcome of whether or not that will impact the effective date. But audience members, if you are a Florida employee or have remote employees in Florida, this will be an important additional consideration in your DE&I strategy. I think companies with a remote workforce, they need to be aware of state legislation and consider how it factors into your compliance considerations. So, Mike, to your point at the very beginning of your answer there, it reminded me to mention this. Marucci, do you have any comments on that? On the first question, not necessarily what I've just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think they've touched on all the key points. It really and truly, and Lauren, I love the way you kind of just, I agree 100%. It starts with inclusion. Why do we do DE&I or ID&E? It's to create an inclusive environment. If you really get down to the root of what we're trying to achieve as a society, it should be about being inclusive every day in everything we do. So I think they've touched the points. I don't know that I would add anything.
All right, excellent. Well, since we're here with you, Marucci, in thinking about your specific journey in your career, what have you seen as far as the evolution of DE&I as the landscape has really moved from almost explicitly on-site to this hybrid arrangement that is really normalized today?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been fortunate enough that I've worked for global organizations with remote or distant workers from the centralized hub most of my career. And so while it is different, the dynamics are different today than they were before, we always had the challenge of, you have an event and you have it in person. You have meetings to connect and collaborate or to learn, and you do them in person. And that really was the way in the future. You bring in speakers or activities, all of which were quite effective. But we always struggled with the individual worker who wasn't at the location, and how did you connect them? I think this became much more real for all organizations as we entered the pandemic, where many more, in fairness, many employees still had to go to work every day through the pandemic, but many more than before actually had to step away from the workplace and quarantine. And how do you connect them then? So I think many of us as organizations had to deal with the question I think Lauren had mentioned. You use the excuse, well, it's the pandemic, so all these programs are on hold, which some did. Or do you go ahead and try to create new creative ways and ideas? And there were all kinds of connection things happening. I think they still happen today. You know, connecting over wine, where everyone gets delivered wine and you do a sommelier tasting, or I mean, there's all kinds of bingo games happening. Do you move to a virtual environment where you still try to get the same core essence of what you're trying to achieve through virtual means? And some of that did happen. I do struggle, and I think you mentioned this, Sal, already. You can do some of those alternate programs that are virtual, and they work to some degree. They still do not replace, in my opinion, the social connection that happens casually. And so I think that's where, as employers, we're starting to see, for us, it's more of a hybrid DE&I. You know, you try to create those opportunities for remote connectivity, but you also encourage those events you do in person to be in person. There's just so much neuroscience around connectivity that I don't think you can replace. And I do think, to kind of tag on to what you said earlier, Sal, there is a concern on my part when you think of women and minorities who happen to be, based on the research I've seen, leveraging more the hybrid work environment or the remote work, and to the point you made, feeling more disconnected. We've got to be very intentional about making sure we create the opportunity for inclusion, whatever the work arrangement is, or we're going to see the deterioration of progression with women and minorities.
So a follow-up question to that, as we move more to hybrid, and I'm not counting Tesla, I think we all saw in the news where they're requiring now 100% of their workforce to come back to the office. But as we're moving more towards a hybrid and even fully remote environment, do you feel like that's the beginning of the degradation of DE&I within a company? I'm trying to frame this question appropriately, but do you think it's the degradation of trying to advance a DE&I strategy, or do you look at it and perceive it as an opportunity to really focus on the things that we kind of overlooked and taken for granted when we were in a normal, quote unquote, normal working environment?
Yeah, my opinion is it's an opportunity to reinvent, refocus, and find new ways. I think that's what COVID did for us in so many different ways. I think there will be organizations that are probably still sitting there with the, well, we just haven't come back to normal, so we're still not doing DE&I events. I think some will be slow back to the trough. But I do think your better organizations are continuing to find new, creative, innovative ways to deliver what is the whole strategy of DE&I. And I think some organizations are resetting that strategy. What is that focus? And how do we deliver it in a way that is fully inclusive to all employees? So I think there's going to be a little bit of both, but I think largely organizations over time will find the balance.
It's a great opportunity for DE&I practitioners to develop programs and strategies and approaches for companies that are struggling with that. Lorraine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I love that you use the word intent, because I think what the hybrid environment, or what COVID has done for DE&I or ID&E is really put intent in there. So for the organization to thrive in an inclusive organization, there has to be that intent. And inclusion links to employee engagement. So there's that benefit as well, and we have to have intent. I think it was, in the workforce when we were face to face, smaller things may have fallen through the cracks. It was a given, where now, I think about the ERGs, the employee resource groups that I work with, and utilizing them to their full advantage for employee engagement and having difficult conversations that normally they may have had by the water cooler. Now it's right, there's the intent to create that safe environment online to have a difficult or a crucial conversation, it's all intent focused versus willy-nilly, right? Versus maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't happen. So I do like that COVID has put intent back into ID&E.
For sure, anything within DE&I, there has to be intentionality. So thank you for underscoring that word. I have a question from the audience, and bear with me as I try to read this. Will the panel define behaviors that drive a culture of inclusion? Also, what is the best approach to training and accountability? Who wants to field that one?
I'll jump in with the training because that's my dissertation. So I think when it comes to training and accountability, you have to recognize that the goal of training is to increase knowledge. Training, so that means training does not necessarily change or shift attitudes and behaviors. All training does is improve knowledge, especially DE&I training. And diversity training in particular has gotten such a bad rap out in the community because often it's perpetuated with an us versus them lens instead of an intersectionality lens. We are all diverse. Or even more so, focusing training specific to one affinity group and not having right as soon as you focus in on one specific affinity, you just lost inclusion. So as far as accountability goes, the accountability is the increase in knowledge. That's your training.
You just said something that struck me. You said that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the ERGs or employee resource groups, are you saying that it doesn't promote inclusivity? Is that what you're?
No, the ERGs absolutely promote inclusivity, right? Providing that they're ERGs with allies.
Sure, absolutely.
If you sit down and say, okay, we are going to have a women's leadership class, you're right. You are through intersectionality negating the difference of other affinities that these women all bring into play. And right, women and men work together, like all genders work together. So again, right, we limit that full lens, we limit that inclusiveness. Like I want to hear my counterpart's perspective to what's being taught. Often that doesn't happen.
Right.
Yeah, I think the point that Lorianne made about training is critical. The quality of the training, though, is really important. And there are so many consultants, I'm not suggesting hrQ, but other consultants that are out there holding themselves out as diversity experts, diversity consultants, diversity trainers, that we've seen it in the cleanup where something that someone said at one of these training sessions gets cited in a lawsuit as evidence of reverse discrimination, or has had a tremendously polarizing effect on the workforce, because once they said something about groups or whatever it might be, others who weren't in that group turned off to it. So it's important to have both, I think, a very careful expert review before you cut the training loose, and also a legal review. It takes, a lot of people to make a village on these kinds of issues, especially an inclusive village. And you need a lot of perspectives, and companies shouldn't just jump for quick solutions. Well, let's bring in this diversity trainer and we'll do this program. On the other hand, I think the pandemic has opened up some great opportunities for training over Zoom, where whatever, your Teams application, whatever it is, where you can get some really high quality speakers and experts on inclusion and leadership and all kinds of topics. Share that, we're a law firm, a global law firm with over 1,400 lawyers in the United States and outside the United States. And really until the pandemic, while we had some form of webinars, we didn't have the kinds of big meetings with really expert speakers and well-known speakers that could be shared with the entire organization. So I think if you get the right content and the right speakers. And it is also made relevant to your organization and what your goals are and where you're located, then I think the pandemic has created some great opportunities to get the message out more broadly than in the old days. There might have been a program in the conference room and 20 people would show up because people were too busy at their desks and they never made it. Certainly in the first half of the pandemic, when we did programs like this on inclusion type issues with leading experts, we had tremendous turnout where people were looking for content and the ability to hear about these issues, in part because they were in isolation at that point. But there are some good opportunities still with the platforms are available to do some quality training in this area.
Yes, and thank you very much, Steph, for asking that question. You know, my 2 cents is that for any training, one, it's critical to have executive buy-in, and that it is from the top, that there's authentic, genuine support to have the training. It can't be perfunctory, it can't be performative, it really has to be genuine and authentic. And then also when you do training, I always recommend that there's always follow-up to that training, because inevitably there's going to be questions that'll rise. There'll be aha moments that happen. There'll be visceral reactions that people aren't equipped necessarily to address or answer. And so when you have such a, I don't want to say provocative, but an important topic like ID&E, that it will raise questions, and that when you present a bunch of content, I think the best ones show the reasons why you should have that kind of training first, to lay the context of why we're doing it in the first place before jumping right into, you know, what is DE&I. So I think that for anyone considering training, that to be, like Mike said, very organized and very methodical about how you go about it, and making sure that you do have executive support.
I'll take the first part of the question, tagging on to what's just been shared by Mike and Lauren, but I think that was around intentionality. I think, as with training, if we go back to the whole purpose of why DE&I or ID&E is important, it really, if it's framed around inclusivity, then everything we do as an organization as it relates to our people should really start with intentionality. But I do believe it starts at the top. I think the executive team and the leadership team really needs to be looking at what we do, why we do it, how we do it, with the spirit of inclusivity. Whether that is hosting an event and making sure we've got all the right people invited, whether that's delivering a certain type of training, why are we delivering it, what's the intent and purpose of it. But in all that we do as an organization, the leadership, top down and bottom up, and what we're doing is done with purpose.
Yes, and thank you for saying that. As in your role, having executive presence to be able to convey that and also participate in those conversations at the beginning. I think it's very important, like you said, that executive level ownership and support is there. Mike, in your line of business, I think we all think that you see both the best intentions of DE&I strategy, where it's genuine, there's authentic effort, like Marucci was talking about, to the perfunctory centric. You know, you're going through the motions. We got to check it off the list kind of scenario. In both scenarios, what are the 3 most overlooked legal aspects that folks tend to miss or underestimate?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alan. I will get to those 3 points that I've distilled at the end, but I think a little context on the legal side of this, or the employment law or HR law advice, is important for everyone to keep in mind. And you know, IDE has gotten a lot of attention, obviously, especially since the pandemic began, and especially since the tragic events surrounding George Floyd's murder, and I'll get back to that in a second. But it's been around in corporate America. I was interviewed by Fortune magazine. I still have the article on my wall in the office over 20 years ago about what companies are doing on diversity, and which ones are successful, and how are they getting there, and what are the risks. And so while the dialogue has definitely amped up since the pandemic, it's been something that's been around, and individual subject matter experts like me have, been advising companies for a long time, essentially how not to shoot yourself in the foot while trying to do the right thing and the thing that is best for your business, because we've seen just too many examples of that happening where it's, a no good deed goes unpunished. And so my practice has evolved over these years to today, where I advise a number of boards of directors of leading public companies and private companies and senior management on both the development and implementation of ID&E efforts, as well as what are the public disclosures they make about those efforts. And those are two different things. Some companies are doing a lot, but they're not disclosing it for any of a number of reasons. Others, especially public companies, are now in a position where they need to disclose it. But some of the factors that have accelerated the ID&E process and putting more pressure on companies to show that they are moving the needle on ID&E, are the following. And they run, coincidentally, a lot of that with the pandemic. I mentioned George Floyd before. That happened, near the beginning of lockdown and that event. And it caused a shift in the dialogue of many of our clients, where previously they had talked about ID&E as an internal initiative for their workforce. And for major financial institutions, technology companies, the dialogue shifted to what can we do on the streets? What can we do outside our organizations to help move the needle on ID&E, whether it was banks doing a better job of lending in underrepresented communities, or technology companies making broadband internet available to underrepresented families that now, because of being in lockdown, needed it for the kids to go to school or for remote workers to work. So certainly we saw that, this increased focus on ESG over the years. Remember, the S of ESG is social, and the ID&E principles fall squarely within ESG. Companies are being rated on their ESG, the S or the ID&E or their CSR, corporate social responsibility, are being rated and evaluated, but especially in public companies, by shareholders and others. It's become a huge retention and recruitment issue, especially in this great resignation period that we are in, when individuals have a greater opportunity at mobility. By and large, they're moving to places that not only offer better professional opportunities, but where they feel more comfortable, where there are people in senior management who look like them, who have a similar background. And so now that we've seen this acceleration, in my law firm, we just had, for the first time in 3 years, our annual partner meeting, and 35% of the partners who were at that meeting had not been partners in the firm at our last retreat, which was right before the pandemic. And so people are moving, they have the opportunities to move, and many are moving to places that have a good track record on these kinds of issues. There's been a lot of work done by activist shareholders and shareholder proposals, and I'll get back and talk a little bit about more. Asset management, investor stewardship programs. What's that about? Well, companies like BlackRock and State Street now are requiring any company that they invest their mutual fund money in to provide information about where they are on various representational metrics, pay equity, all kinds of issues, release their EEO-1 data forms. And if companies are unwilling to do that, by and large, these large stewardship programs have said, we will not invest in your companies for our funds. So you can imagine that becomes a tremendous driver of behavior if you're going to lose investors in your particular company. The SEC has come out with human capital management required disclosures for public companies. What are those? At this point, the rule is a little bit ambiguous. It requires companies to disclose information about their workforce that is material to that company's operation. And that's left a lot of wiggle room for companies to determine, well, pay equity is not really material to our organization, or the representation of underrepresented groups in our senior management is not that material, so we're not going to disclose it. But the SEC, under a new chairman and a Democratic-controlled administration, has announced, and we can expect, I think, in the next 3 months, a revised rule to the human capital management required disclosures for public companies that will require them to disclose specifics, like where are they on pay equity, what percentage of senior management are Black employees, Hispanic employees, all other kinds of issues, and why, what's the reasoning behind it. In the current materiality rule, it's hard to compare one disclosure against the other if everyone isn't disclosing the same kind of data. If companies are now required to disclose certain kinds of data, like where are they on pay equity, or what is the percentage of Black employees in their top 4 pay grades, for example, then it's hard to compare one company to another for those investors and for consumers who want to purchase products from what they consider to be more socially responsible companies. So there's a lot of pressure on that front. Even if you're not a public company, that pressure is spilling over because there's a competitive reason to be a leader on these issues. We've seen major financial institutions, and we've been advisors to some of them, kind of jockey for position to get the top ratings from some of these activist shareholders on ID&E type issues, because they think it's a real competitive advantage when they go out, and if they're pitching a bond deal for a particular state, to be able to say they're a leader on these kinds of initiatives is a big plus in the business process. So it becomes really a very important part of that. Another interesting thing that we are seeing is what's happening in the shareholder proposal area. Let me get back, though, to your first question, with that as background as to, what are, the 3 most overlooked legal aspects when companies implement diversity initiatives and or make disclosures about those issues. The first is, everyone has to remember, this is not, talk is cheap, but there is legal liability for talking the talk, but not walking the walk, especially if you're a public company. And even if you're not a public company, these things will come up in individual lawsuits where a plaintiff who's been discriminated against will come out as part of his lawsuit or her lawsuit and say the company really was way behind on any ID&E initiatives, didn't say much about it. All of our competitors have all of these programs, and so there was no commitment to it. There was no training. That's why I was discriminated. So again, there is this legal liability for either failing to achieve aspirational goals that are set or promises that certain initiatives will be implemented. And we've seen a lot of that, and we've already seen any of a number of shareholder lawsuits where, for example, a company committed to increasing the diversity of its board of directors, as many companies have, and as many of you know, California legislation, which is under attack, has required more diverse membership on boards of directors. And there have been companies that have made specific commitments as to what they would do with respect to diversity of their board. 2 or 3 years passes, and lo and behold, they haven't made any progress on those goals. And we've seen shareholder suits that the companies misled investors about the seriousness of their commitment to these efforts. And had these shareholders known that the company wasn't serious about it and didn't mean it, they would not have invested in it. And if the stock price is down, it's down because the company hasn't achieved some of these goals. And so we've seen a variety of those. And then on the flip side, we've seen now, especially in the last year, a lot of reversed discrimination claims. And when things are not done properly, and we've seen that companies that have stated hiring or representation goals, even though they've said that they are aspirational, or then argued to be really quotas, which are unlawful under federal and state discrimination law and are attacked in lawsuits. Many of you may have seen back in October of last year, there was a $10 million jury verdict against a company called Novant, N-O-V-A-N-T Health, in the federal court in North Carolina, in a suit brought by a white male who was a former senior vice president at Novant, who alleged that he was fired as part of an intentional campaign to promote diversity in its management ranks. And we've heard about that, and we've always talked about these reverse discrimination cases, but this jury actually was convinced that that had happened based upon emails and things that people had said and how their programs were written, and awarded him a $10 million verdict for wrongful termination and for discrimination in the context of this lawsuit. Now that's on appeal. It may not stand up, but it's interesting to see that development. The other thing we're seeing a lot of, and I'm getting back to a comment I made early, this political environment that we were in, we're seeing a number of organizations who are funded by conservative thinking groups that are now sending in shareholder proposals to leading companies, asking, number one, either that they audit all of their diversity practices to determine what the impact has been on their business. And more recently, we've seen a group of a dozen proposals that are known as retraction proposals, where this activist shareholder group is citing specific DE&I policies of a company and saying, whether it's a representational goal or a commitment to achieve board diversity, that those policies are unlawful under applicable state and federal discrimination law, or Section 1981, and asking the companies to retract those DE&I policies because they will subject the company to legal risk if someone sues the company over that, and to monetary damage, and therefore, as a shareholder, they are arguing it's not in the best interest of the company. And so that is, a very interesting development, and I think that's kind of the second point, that you can be damned if you do, damned if you don't in this space, which is why it's important to consider this carefully. And now I come to my third point. A cross-functional legal team and operational team of HR and corporate governance experts all need to have a seat at the table in terms of formulation of initiatives, decisions being made about what is publicly disclosed about these things. We've seen with many of our clients, the problems have come up, especially since the SEC has required these human capital management disclosures, where the securities lawyers, and this isn't a knock on the securities lawyers or the disclosure lawyers that always did the proxy statement and the 10K, but didn't have a real feel for what you could say about diversity that might cross the line, etc., were writing those disclosures, which as they were written became problematic, and they weren't subject to being reviewed by employment lawyers or by HR or by somebody in the company's diversity group. And so this is an area, and that third point is you really need to bring a lot of subject matter experts, both on the legal side and operational side, together to really review, once the objectives are set, to make sure everyone has a chance to weigh in and decide. At the end of the day, there's going to be opposition to going as far as a certain thing. Maybe it's a program that might only be open to diverse individuals, but a company is saying, we'll take the risk on that because we think it's important to try to make progress on this. At the end, it's a risk reward type analysis, but at least everyone should be informed and have input into that process, a broad array of subject matter experts on this, so that the best, informed decision can be made. It always won't be the right decision for the reasons I said, and companies have different levels of litigation risk tolerance, or what we've heard from many of our clients, especially our in-house employment law colleagues. They tell us, well, I raised my hand on that particular program and said, you know, that one is a little bit over the line, but the train had already left the station. And the problem is the train shouldn't leave the station, at least until everyone has a chance to weigh in and an informed decision is made. So those would be the 3 items.
Nice to say that in any organization who decides to tackle this, to have use, like you said, operational and legal, that they're all lockstep in the planning, the execution, and the audit of that on a continuous basis. That was a lot of great information, a lot of which probably some of the audience may not have been aware of. I certainly wasn't aware of all the things that you were talking about. So thank you very much, Mike, for that level of expertise. And audience, if you have further questions with regards to what Mike said, we don't have as much time left as I'd like, but shoot them on the questions pane. We'll make sure that we get them answered for you. But thank you, Mike, for that very comprehensive response there. Loran, when dealing with DE&I with folks that are spread out geographically from coast to coast, what's the most important thing to absolutely focus on and optimize?
I really think it comes back to team building and that intent of reaching out. And again, deciding what you're going to focus on. What are we focusing on, right? So it's so easy right now in this COVID hybrid world to become siloed within the organization, that we're not functioning across or we're not collaborating across the company, in large part because we don't see these individuals now whom we may have saw on a day in, day out basis. And then you add the spread. I work with Commonwealth Care Alliance in Boston, and our employees are all over the United States. And I think it's really important, as a leader, to ensure that we're collaborating effectively, or collaborating, as I like to call it, collaborating with intent, so that we continue that inclusive culture and engagement.
Yes, and to your point, Loran, I think a lot of companies should also focus on their onboarding. It's much different now than people just walking in the office and being onboarded that way. There's non-traditional, or actually now it's the now normal of traditional onboarding of remote folks. So for a lot of companies, they haven't recalibrated or reviewed that process to accommodate for those folks that are remote. So when you're doing your onboarding from a DE&I perspective, we're working with a client now proposing a strategy and approach that encapsulates not only onboarding for folks that are physically there on site, but also to encapsulate the onboarding of folks that are remote as well. So make sure you don't forget about that.
Oh, that could be like a whole nother show.
Absolutely.
How
to onboard appropriately. That does, and I'm going to go sideways here, it does impact your entire employer brand from that day forward, not just DE&I, but just in general. But that's a whole nother webinar series that we can have. So
that's a whole nother topic, right?
Absolutely.
And we can throw right in there like training strategies and
exactly.
ID&E training strategies.
So
sure.
We'll do that for another show. Marucci, this question is important because we all know that you can have the most diverse employee population, and that's what a lot of companies have been focused on, getting diverse employee population. But as we've all talked about today, without inclusivity and that sense of belonging, there will always be challenges. So for you, because of who you work with, it's such a huge workforce at DFW, and it can be argued that some are remote, even though they're on site because of the vast expanse of the airport, just physically. How can you cultivate, or how do you cultivate a sense of inclusivity and belonging amongst your employees when it's that big?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think many of us have that challenge, right? Whether it's across the expansiveness of DFW or across the US or across the globe. I think it all comes back to, I'm going to just take us back for a second, and Lorraine mentioned previously, that you've got D, you've got E, and you've got I, and they're all uniquely separate, right? And so I think first and foremost, one of the things we do very well at DFW is the D, which is really having not only employees, board employees, we have lots of partners, we have lots of third-party contingent workforce, and we do, given that we're an international airport, we have the need pretty down. We've got a diverse employee group. And I think of the quote from Maya Angelou, we should all know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry. And we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what their color. So we do truly believe diversity matters, because diversity means so many different things, and it's so many different people from different backgrounds coming together. So that's kind of, that's super important to us, and we've got that. So then what the inclusion piece is really what matters next, right? Not only are people just kind of all over the place, we also have the traveling public that we need to be conscious of. And creating that environment of inclusion within our workforce and within the workforce that don't directly belong to us, but that partner with us to deliver the services of the traveling public is important. And so under the umbrella of our 1DFW, it's the intentionality of finding ways to ensure, there's two words I wrote down on this question, it's listen and engage. So we continuously spend the time to really listen, not just through formal engagement surveys, which we do, but also making sure our leaders are truly connected with their workforce and understanding at the grassroots, what are people feeling? Do they feel connected to their workforce, to their peers, to our 1DFW? And if they're not, why? And how do we go about addressing that challenge? So for us, it's, again, top down, bottom up. It's making sure that in everything we do, we are sensitive to where we are at that moment in time, because things also change. So we may have it down and mastered today, and something changes in our pace or way of working, and people start feeling disconnected. So it is ensuring that in all that we do, we are constantly listening and engaging our workforce. Now, with respect to initiatives, and I think we've struggled with this like others have. To your point, within DFW, we've got buildings all over the place. We're a city, right? So we've got people all the way to the north that are in Grapevine, and people all the way to the south that are in Euless. And so it's being intentional about, as I mentioned before, there are some things we have established can be done virtually. So how do we create those experiences to include everyone? Whether it's, we have a lot of speakers that will come in and share with us different learning opportunities. We provide some of those virtually, but we still really truly hold strong that we have certain events we want to do in person, and we want that human connectivity. And so for us, it has been a balance of, you know, we've got a workforce that's 24 hours, 7 days a week. So the challenge of how do we make sure that whatever we're doing in person during the workday, we can extend some of those same benefits and same opportunities for people to participate, even if they're not at the core event. And we're open to ideas, because we're certainly not perfect in this space, but we're at least being intentional about listening and reacting and creating that sense of engagement with our workforce.
And as you say, Marucha, you're open to ideas. This is not a moment, but a movement, right? All of this that we're talking about. Want to be respectful of time. We could, as with all these roundtables, we can go on forever talking about this, but we're about 10 minutes out, a little less than that. I'd love to take opportunity if there's anyone else with last minute questions in the audience, but does anyone have anything exciting that you'd like to share with the audience that you're working on? Mike, anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think this whole area of shareholder proposals and advising boards of directors on how to respond to them is a fascinating area. And now with this new wave of these retraction proposals, I think we're going to see more of them. A number of major companies have been the targets of them, from Coca-Cola to Lowe's to a couple of the financial services industry companies, et cetera, which essentially asks those companies to roll back all of what they think are these great initiatives that took them so long to put in place. You know, trying to advise boards how to deal with that when someone is claiming those policies go too far, they are over the line of legality, and they are subjecting the company to legal risk. And so now the board, who may have been 100% committed to moving the needle on ID&E has to step back and start asking questions. Well, have we gone a little too far on some of these things? And so we're seeing, not at all just moving in one direction, full speed ahead, like immediately after the George Floyd tragedy. It was like, who could come out with the most comprehensive new initiatives, both internally at the company and helping the communities, the underrepresented communities, and get all of that out more quickly to show that they were doing something. Now the pendulum is swinging back. It's going to be, I think, a big issue, whether it's the Florida state legislation or legislation in other states in the context of, the midterm elections now, as to how these issues will come out. So there's a lot of different elements. This is not just straight ahead at full speed without back. There are stops and starts along the way. And boards of directors want to be assured that they're doing the right thing. The real problem is the law in this area is tremendously unsettled. And while it's not an employment case, I think many of you in the audience will know that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the Harvard University college admissions case, where the First Circuit Court of Appeals approved Harvard University's policy of considering diversity as a factor in deciding what applicants to admit to Harvard University. And the First Circuit upheld that because of what they found to be the positive benefits and the reasonableness of applying such a circumstance. The betting odds are that this Supreme Court, which is predominated mostly now by conservative justices, may have a very different view of that and may reverse that case. And even though it's not an employment case, a lot of us observers think that it will have a lot to say about voluntary diversity initiatives by companies and where those lines can be drawn, again, even though it's not specifically about employment. So the exciting thing, I think, is the challenges of doing the right thing, moving things forward here, but understanding that in the society we live in, with a lot of different views, it's not going to be a straight ahead process. There will be legal challenges, and there will have to be some way that all of these good things can happen in a way that's legal under our current laws.
Main point is that the end game and the end destination is not going to be a straight line, and then we all have to be vigilant about our approaches and our policies. So thank you, Mike. Lorraine.
Yeah, what I've got going on is in the fall under Ellis Publishing, I actually have another book coming out. And this one is called Evidence-Based Inclusion, focusing on the right needle. And it's really exciting. It's in edit review right now. And, the listeners that are out there, find me on LinkedIn and let me know, and I'll gladly send you a complimentary PDF of the book.
There you go. Everybody listen to that. So make sure you take advantage of that, folks. Congratulations, Lorraine.
Thank you.
Marucci.
I think the big thing for us at the airport, and I've only been here about a half a year, 6 months or so, has been really expanding the allyship. So the airport's been really strong in their ERGs, and I left Lorraine where you talked about, but you've got to have allyship. And so there was a big initiative a couple years ago, to start and roll out the concept of allyship. So it's been rolled, but we're really trying to take that to a whole new level and engage the entire workforce in all areas. So that's really been our focus here.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation, very meaty. On behalf of hrQ, Landrum HR, and the audience, Marucci, Lorraine, Mike, thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us. Audience, if you take a moment before you exit, excuse me, to answer the survey as you exit the webinar, this helps us out a great deal in identifying future topics and formats. So for hrQ, Landrum HR, I'm Sal Vergara. Thank you for accommodating my cough today. Until next time, elevate yourself and those around you. Thanks again, panel, for your time and your efforts today. Appreciate it.